Welcome back to Capital Conversations, everybody. We are on Zoom this week because the members that we cover, mostly the House, are gone. And I think I
Thank
can
God.
speak for both of us that we are happy to have a break.
Yes, the last 3 weeks have been some of the busiest. I feel like covering Capitol Hill that wasn't a reconciliation fight or like big beautiful bill related or like obviously spending fights are always long weeks, but this has just
Mhm.
been so much between like Venezuela and the Affordable Care Act tax credit extension vote from discharge petitions with government funding with just like so many things happening that it's been so hard to keep up and stay sane.
Yeah, and it is my pleasure and honor to say these words to our viewers and our listeners that finally, the House has passed all 12 appropriations bills. Yay.
Wild.
So maybe I won't have to talk about it for a long time until September. But the fight is not over yet because this week the Senate now has to pass six of the bills and they're shoved into one package. There's already some Democrats who have come out and said they're not going to vote for it. Yikes. So that is definitely going to be something that we are watching this week because if they make any changes, the House has to come right back and fix it. And that deadline, that pesky little deadline for a government shutdown, is on Friday. So that is going to be
Yeah.
something that we're tracking. But for now, we're trying to take a nice deep breath. Just appreciate the fact that maybe I won't have to give an appropriations update again for several months.
And yes, I think that the House has made this an uphill battle vote in the Senate, which honestly, I don't blame them. The Senate has given the House a lot of uphill battles whenever they've sent bills back with, whether it be reconciliation or the spending package to reopen the government with like added provisions that the House didn't like. And the House just kind of had to eat it because at that point, they were up to a deadline and they just had to pass it and they felt jammed. And so I think that this was kind of the House's payback on jamming the Senate because, like you said, like that government funding deadline is coming up on Friday. There's Arctic frost like across the entire country. People are having snowstorms or ice storms. And so, like, getting the House back, if they do make provisions, would be kind of difficult on a week like this, where there's just like a lot of craziness, a lot of campaigning. We're a month and a half out from the first primary. It's just the Senate just kind of has to suck it up and pass this. So we'll see what it's like. They added that repeal to the Arctic frost provision that was snuck in last minute whenever they reopened the government back in November that House members were
Yeah, that was
so mad
sneaky.
about.
That was a
It
little
was so
sneaky last
sneaky.
week.
Yes. And so the provision that the Senate added, so there's this thing called Arctic frost where the Biden DOJ investigated and subpoenaed senators and House members' phone records. And they allowed the senators whose phone records were subpoenaed to be allowed to sue for like up to $500,000 or even millions, kind of allowing them to receive compensation for that breach of privacy or whatever they want to call it from special councilman Jack Smith, who is like very big deal in Republican politics. They hate him. He has caused them a lot of anger, I would say, to put it
Yeah.
lightly. He testified last week before the House, but obviously House members were going to be mad. They one number one were like, "You're in public office. You shouldn't be receiving millions of dollars from this. Also, why didn't you include us?" And I think that that's more where they were a little bit butthurt is that the House members weren't included. But I want to say that's one of the only things that was somewhat like up in the air or the Senate liked it that the House didn't that passed unanimously. Like that's even the Epstein files after Trump backed it still did not pass unanimously. So I kind of thought that was a big deal that was put in last minute that everyone agreed on, which was
It
crazy
was
for the
weird. And
House.
I remember, and for people who don't, and most people don't understand like how we track people, but we have this app that tracks members and it doesn't give us their names, which it should. If I was an app
Agreed.
developer, I would totally be on
Like
that.
if you
But
clicked like
like
the no votes, it should say who.
exactly. And, make our lives easier. And when we were doing that Arctic frost provision, there was like one Republican voting no. And I remember everybody was like, oh my God, who is it? Ended up being a mistake. They didn't remember what they were voting for. So then it ended up passing unanimously. And I think everybody was kind of like, wow, like we didn't expect that. Like you don't really see Democrats and Republicans like getting along very often. But last week definitely was one of those things where there was like a lot of conversations about appropriations. Obviously, DHS, Homeland Security, and ICE were big deals. But now they've shifted it over to the Senate. And with the end of this appropriations series, I guess you could call it, we now are shifting into a more chill year. There's still other things that have to happen. There's obviously, we've talked about before, the stock trading ban. That's going to
Mm.
come up, I'm sure, in February, or it's going to come up when it comes up, honestly. And
It's
then
gonna
there's
cause
other things with
problems.
yes, it has a lot of problems like everything. And then there's the SAVE Act, which is something that was stemming from, last year and even the year before. And it's an election integrity bill that Republicans really want. That's going to be something that the Senate has to deal with. And so while we are kind of taking a sigh of relief for appropriations and keeping in mind that we have like those other little things coming up, the biggest thing that we're going to be shifting to as a show is moving into our coverage of elections, which I'm super excited about.
Yay!
Yay,
I can't
it's so
wait.
much
I
fun.
honestly am excited for a change of pace and scenery. And
Mhm.
I know that we've said this a million times. Obviously, we're nerds whenever it comes to campaigns and elections and exit polling. And we get way too excited about it. But a change in scenery and pace is going to be so nice. Maybe not pace, like campaigns move very fast, but
Yeah, no, we'll still be busy, but
definitely I would say pace is like different. Like they're both fast, but just like in their own ways because campaigns have an end date. Like Congress doesn't have an end date. We're gonna have Congress there forever, whereas every campaign has an end date. So seeing an end in sight makes pace feel different.
yeah, and there's going to be races that we are going to try to cover to get everybody up to speed. I know we've gotten both individually a ton of questions about certain races, and we both at times have had to be like, oh, we don't know a ton about that specific race. Like, we'll
Mm-hmm.
get back to you. So, part of the fun that we're kind of unveiling on this episode is that we're going to start to do state-centric episodes, and they might be a little bit shorter, they might be a little bit longer, depending on what kind of information is coming out. But before we kind of kick into that series, what we wanted to do is with this episode is kind of from a house perspective, get an idea of what 2026 is going to look like. And so we are going to hear from Cook Political Report House analyst Erin Covey. She's one of my favorite people ever. She always answers my calls and my texts. And so we are going to hear from her now about the upcoming elections. Well, welcome, Erin, to Capital Conversations. We're happy to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
And you are kind of one of our first guests that we've had that is not a lawmaker or a strategist, which is really fun. And I think what we've heard from a lot of our listeners and viewers is that they're very curious about elections. This is a big year,
Yeah.
2026 midterms. And so I wanted to get your take on, with the amount of work that you've done for midterms and general elections just over the years, what about this midterm cycle is standing out to you?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a really tough cycle for Republicans because their control of the House is so narrow right now. So currently, as it stands, Democrats would need to flip 3 seats to win a majority this November. Now, of course, we've had a lot of redistricting over the past several months, and so that has impacted the playing field a little bit. But in terms of overall control, Democrats have largely been able to offset Republicans' gains in places like Texas and North Carolina. And so, what we're projecting in terms of redistricting is that it will be a wash with neither party netting more than maybe a couple of seats. And so, with that, that puts Democrats in a good position to take back the House. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what the national environment is going to look like in November. We're still a long ways out. But the indicators that we have seen so far point to a fairly typical midterm election where midterms are almost always going to be a referendum on the party that's in power. And so, of course, in this case, that's Republicans. There's only been a few exceptions to that in modern history. There were two elections in 1998 and then in 2002 where the president's party actually picked up seats in the House in the midterms. But those, again, have been the exceptions. And those happened at a time where both sitting presidents had approval ratings that were in the 60s. But right now, of course, Trump's approval rating is in the low 40s. We're seeing that Democrats have a lead of a couple of points on the generic congressional ballot. And in special elections and in the off year elections in Virginia and New Jersey that we saw last year, Democrats have overperformed their 2024 margins in a lot of these places by a considerable amount of points. And that just goes to show that Democrats have a lot more enthusiasm right now among their base for turning out, whereas Republican base voters are just less likely to turn out in these off-year elections. And of course, midterms, they're going to be higher turnout, so you can't make a one-to-one comparison, but it does show that Democrats currently are the party of enthusiastic voters right now, which is what you would expect, I think, in a midterm like this.
Can you talk a little bit about how, if that enthusiasm that was seen in 2025 in November in states like New Jersey or Virginia, if that's going to correlate into next November? I know that a year is a long time to keep enthusiasm up, but do you expect that enthusiasm to continue throughout all of 2026?
Yeah, look, I mean, what we have seen for the large part in these midterm cycles is that special elections are a good indicator of which party has the enthusiasm going into a midterm. And while, of course, they're lower turnout elections, and so the electorate is going to be different than the electorate that we're going to see voting in a midterm cycle, it does typically point to increased enthusiasm among the party that's out of power. And so we would expect that to stay the same. Of course, things can always upset that. Like in 2022, we saw the overturning of Roe v. Wade by the Supreme Court. That really gave Democrats a jolt of enthusiasm that they didn't have going into that cycle. And so that they were able to kind of blunt Republicans' pickups in the House and the Senate that cycle. And, in the House, Republicans still picked up the 9 seats, which was a couple more than they needed for a majority. And so they were still able to take the majority, but they weren't able to flip the 20 plus seats that they had hoped to, I think, going into the cycle. So, of course, there is still plenty of time for some kind of major news event to shake things up. But I think based on the position that Democrats are in now, and just based on the fact that Republicans have such a slim majority right now, Democrats are, I think, going to be in a good position to take back the House.
And so you work for Cook Political Report, which, if people don't know what that is, it's a nonpartisan index. You guys take a look at a lot of races, House, Senate, whatnot. And recently, you guys released a list of 18 or so seats that have trended towards Democrats a little bit, whether it was moving from lean to solid or toss up to lean Democrat. And can you talk about maybe why you guys decided to make those decisions? What factors contributed to those races shifting? And then also, what are some key House races that people who maybe don't know everything about DC, but who are interested in the elections should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so I think overall, some of these races were ones that we had talked about potentially moving for a couple of months. Some of them were ones that have had more recent developments that sparked movements in these races. So there were, of course, individual district specific reasons that we moved all these races. But I think overall, what impacted all of them was the fact that the national environment looks different than it did at the beginning of 2025 when we first released these ratings. And, going into a cycle, we don't know exactly what the environment is going to look like. And so a lot of our ratings are a little bit more weighted heavily towards the most recent election results. And of course, in 2024, we saw Trump win the popular vote and do quite a bit better than a lot of folks were expecting in places that had normally heavily favored Democrats. And so that kind of changed the way that some Democrats were looking at their races and seats that you would ordinarily think of as fairly safe places like New Jersey's 9th district, where Democrat Nellie Poe represents. This is a part of the country that, again, had been significantly bluer than it was in 2024. And so after that election, Democrats were like, well, we don't know kind of how our coalition is changing, how the Republicans' coalitions is changing, how is that going to impact these races going forward. But what we have seen, and I don't think this is too surprising, is that one, in a midterm cycle, the types of voters who powered Trump's victory last cycle, a lot of those voters may not necessarily be turning out in a midterm cycle just because these are voters that typically vote less frequently. And so in a midterm cycle, they're not as likely to vote than in a presidential cycle. And so the turnout dynamic is inherently a bit more difficult for Republicans going into that. And at the same time, we've seen over the past several years, Democrats' base has become much more populated by college educated, wealthier voters who are the most reliable voters. And so that has also given Democrats an advantage in elections that tend to be lower turnout versus a presidential election, which is drawing a larger pool of voters to the polls. And so you have that dynamic, but then you also see that in terms of where Trump's own approval rating is at, it took a pretty significant dip in April after he started rolling out some of his tariff policies. And it's been relatively steady ever since. And you know what, when we dig into that data, we see that his approval rating among Republicans and among Democratic voters is remarkably stable. The people who don't like him don't like him. The people who like him. And there's not a lot that he can do to change that. But among the independent voters who could swing some of these really close House races, we have seen a dip in his approval rating. We've also seen a dip in his approval rating among young voters and Hispanic voters in particular who moved towards him from 2020 to 2024. And so based on all of those kind of national indicators, that was why the overarching reason that the number of races that moved. But we can dig into some of the specific races if we want to go into details on some of those dynamics.
Yeah, I'm curious, like what race maybe, I know it's so hard to pick. There's 435 of them, but what is like one race in particular that you or just Cook Political Report in general are really going to be focusing on this year? Like it's going to be one that is kind of surprising or interesting or like getting spicy. Like I'm curious what you guys are kind of taking a look at.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I mean, we have 18 House races that are rated toss up. And so those are going to be the ones right now that we expect will get the most attention. But one that I'll point out that we did move in the most recent round of ratings changes is Texas 34, which is a district in South Texas held by Democrat Vicente Gonzalez. This is a district that has moved really dramatically to the right over the past decade or so. And a lot of that has been powered by Trump's popularity among Hispanic voters in South Texas. And so this district went from a district that Biden won by a couple of points in 2020 to one that Trump won by 10 points in 2024. And it was also redrawn during the redistricting that happened last year in Texas to be a couple of points more red at the presidential level. However, what we have seen is that these are also voters who are not reliable Republican voters. A lot of them are voters who like Trump, but are also still willing to vote for Democrats like Gonzalez, or just may not be, again, turning out to vote in a midterm cycle as they were in a presidential cycle. And so because of that, even though he's sitting in a seat that Trump won by 10 points, and if you look at just the 2024 presidential number, you might think, okay, that's a really tough seat for a Democrat to win. And don't get me wrong, it is going to be a tough race for Gonzalez regardless. But if we're looking at how he and how other Democrats have performed in that district in other races, it has been quite a bit more competitive. And so looking at that and looking at kind of the uncertainty around where Hispanic voters are going to be on Trump in November and how likely they are to turn out, we decided to shift that one from lean R into toss up, indicating that, we think Gonzalez still has a decent chance at winning re-election. It's going to be really tough. And I think the Republican nominee is probably going to be Eric Flores, who was recently endorsed by Trump. Now, of course, he still has a primary to get through, so we'll see how that plays out. And I think Republicans point to him as one of their strongest recruits of the cycle. So, it could get a little bit dicier for Gonzalez, depending on how well Flores is able to do. But I think at this point, it really looks more like a toss-up than a Republican-leaning district.
Yeah, I feel like I have a lot of thoughts about all of those I'm from Texas, so I obviously analyze like the election results from Texas very in depth, but I feel like those counties in those districts in 2024 were like some of the most indicative counties in like the shift of voters, especially Latino voters. And I was just wondering your thought on, obviously in a midterm year, you like the trends swing opposite of the president in the White House, or like Democratic voters are more enthusiastic, but how is that going to change based on redistricting other than just that one seat kind of in the southern border and in Texas in general, with them being the first primary of the year? Like I think that Texas is going to be one of the most like detrimental states this year in the election cycle.
Yeah, so I'll talk about Texas specifically. So when Republicans redrew the map last year, they drew it in a way that could potentially allow them to pick up as many as 5 seats. But I think from the beginning, it was clear that 2 of those seats, Texas 34, which I just talked about, and then Texas 28, which is held by Democrat Henry Cuellar, were still going to be competitive races. 2 of the seats that Texas Republicans redrew, one in Dallas and one in the Houston suburbs, those are 2 safe Republican pickups. At least that's how they look right now. And then you have one in the San Antonio exurbs, Texas 35, that we have rated as likely Republicans. So we believe a Republican's definitely favored to flip that seat. However, it's not necessarily a given in the same way that the other two seats are. However, the last two seats on that list, Texas 34 and Texas 28, are going to be a lot more competitive. And so I think the real question with Republicans, because I get this question a lot, what if by gerrymandering Texas further, Republicans endangered some of their own incumbents because there's only so many ways you can rearrange your the opposing party's voters, and will they risk turning into the Texas map into a dummy mander where some of your own incumbents end up in competitive races inadvertently? I don't think that's the case because Republicans were able to draw the map in a way where their own incumbents are not in any worse shape than they would have been before. Now, there's maybe a couple of members, folks like Monica de la Cruz, who could potentially be in a competitive race, but the new Texas map did not change her district that much. So the real question is whether or not Republicans are actually able to pick up 5 seats. On a bad night for Republicans, they could only end up picking up 2 seats in Texas. And so that is a part of why the redistricting outlook is maybe not quite as good for Republicans as it looked last summer. But the main reason it's not as good for them is because Democrats have been able to respond in states like California and now Virginia, where they are now gerrymandering their own maps to allow them to pick up seats. And so we've kind of plotted out the different scenarios of like which of these seats could flip on a good night for Republicans or on a good night for Democrats. And it really does look like it's going to ultimately be a wash. A good night for Democrats may mean that they actually net seats as a result of redistricting alone, which is a wild possibility given how this started last summer, but is well within the range of possibilities right now. And of course, there's a couple of other states that might still redistrict. Virginia is moving towards it. It looks likely that there's going to be a special election this April where Virginia voters will decide, like California voters did, whether or not they want to bless a Democratic gerrymander in their state. But Florida is also talking about redistricting. We have a pending Supreme Court decision on the Voting Rights Act, which, depending on when they rule on that, could impact other red states' ability to draw more favorable maps for themselves. But even with that, I don't think Republicans are going to be able to pick up the seats that they would need to really insulate themselves from losing a majority.
I think redistricting is so interesting too because kind of like you said, nothing is totally set in stone because I think last year everybody kind of freaked out about Texas and then everyone was kind of freaking out about California and then it kind of subsided and then all of a sudden so many states were trying. You saw the attempt in Indiana and that didn't work out, but Ohio's was successful and like each state has their own different laws. So I think what we were getting a lot of questions about is like, oh, well, why can one state do it, but the other state can't? And like, why are Republicans mad at Democrats for doing it in California, but then they were defending it in Texas? And it's like, well, a lot of states have different like guardrails that they have to jump through. And I think a lot of people just like don't understand that. So it'll definitely be
Yeah.
something that we are paying attention to this year because, any ruling at any moment could just like shake up everything.
Yeah, and I think, the political realities for these state legislators varies state by state. And in a place like Kansas or Indiana, you've got quite a few more moderate Republican state legislators who represented fairly competitive districts, but also just were more moderate themselves and did not want to further gerrymander their states just to help their national party. And so, we did not know how that was going to pan out going into it. It's certainly clear that Trump obviously has a lot of influence with Republican politicians in all of these states, and he was able to convince Texas and North Carolina and Missouri to redistrict without much of a hassle, but he's faced more resistance in some of these other states. And then on the flip side, I think Democrats, in places like California and Virginia, voters had instituted these independent or bipartisan redistricting commissions previously to make the map drawing process more fair. Now, of course, when Democrats wanted to retaliate, that was a hindrance to them because that prevents them from being able to really gerrymander their states to the max. But when it was on the ballot, when voters were given the opportunity to allow Democratic politicians to do that in states like California, they were more than willing to do that because it was seen as a way that they could push back on Trump. So all of the politics has become much more nationalized on one hand. And so I think that's it. on one hand, that has been a little bit surprising to see how willing voters were in California to do that sort of thing. But at the same time, some of these local political realities also matter in places like Indiana and Kansas. So it really does vary state to state. And of course, to your point earlier, Rachel, a lot of these states have different laws around redistricting. Some states explicitly ban mid-decade redistricting, and amending the Constitution or changing the law the process varies widely from state to state. So it's really not always clear, I think, how far parties are able to go in gerrymandering.
To kind of shift topics a little bit, I think that Democrats, as you said earlier, are kind of heading into this midterm year, or they should be heading into it maybe a little bit more excited. And then they obviously are coming off the 2024 election where a lot of them are feeling defeated because of everything that happened with Trump. And so, on one hand, Democrats are kind of on this high note, but then also they're facing this reality where some progressives are wanting to come and kick out the incumbents. They're saying that, after 2024, we need a new slate, we need new blood, and we need to get new people in here. So, like, what is happening is you're seeing a lot of progressives versus this establishment, proxy war happening across several states. I wanted to just get your thoughts on that and how potentially these races are turning into this progressive versus establishment battleground, and if you think that's going to hurt chances for Democrats heading into the midterms.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, overall, I don't think it's going to hurt them much. There may be some places where a primary outcome impacts whether or not Democrats are able to flip a seat. But I would say, for the most part, from what we have seen in history, it really won't hamper them that much because, again, ultimately, midterms are about the party that's in power, not the party that's out of power. And, we saw in 2010 when Republicans were going through their whole Tea Party moment, that did not hinder them from flipping 60 seats in the House. And so, even if Democrats are kind of in the middle of a bit of an identity crisis where a lot of their own voters don't like their leadership, don't like the party, and they have a bad brand right now, I don't know that that is going to actually impact the outcome of the midterms that much. Now, it definitely will have more of an impact on 2028 and the kind of person who ultimately wins the presidential nomination in 2028 on the Democrat side. But I don't think it has a huge impact on 2026 as far as control of the House goes. Now, at the same time, you do have some of these incumbents who are facing younger and or more progressive challengers in the House, and that's going to be really interesting to watch just to see what the future of the Democratic Party looks like. I think from my perspective, incumbents are very difficult to unseat. Last cycle, there were only 3 incumbents who lost their primaries to challenger candidates. 2 of them, Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, were Democrats that were ousted by more moderate Democrats who
Oh,
had
yeah.
a
That seems
much
like so long
bigger,
ago.
so long ago, right? But there was a huge financial differential between the incumbents and the challengers. The challengers had much more money on their side. And then you had Bob Good on the Republican side, was ousted by a candidate, John McGuire, who's of course now in Congress, who was endorsed by Trump. And so it really takes quite a bit to actually get rid of an incumbent, even a less popular incumbent. So for a lot of these Democratic incumbents who are facing primary challengers, I think we would expect that most of them probably will be fine. But there are certainly some folks who are probably in more danger than others. People like David Scott in Georgia, I would say, potentially someone like Dan Goldman in New York. Those are the Democratic incumbents who are probably in the most danger right now.
And to follow up on that, you're seeing some centrist House Democrats wanting to leave the House and go to the Senate. A couple that come to mind are like Angie Craig. She's trying to run for Minnesota Senate. What do you make of some of these more moderate members kind of upping and leaving the House to try and go for higher office? And do you think that that's indicative of all of this kind of, as you said, like identity crisis that Democrats are going through right now?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would say is that a lot of the moderates in the House who have run for higher office or are running for higher office, I think it's more of a function of the fact that these are folks who became kind of Democratic Party stars in 2018 when they flipped competitive House seats. And so, of course, by nature, you would expect the members who are winning these competitive races to typically be further to the center politically on both sides. And so that was folks like Angie Craig and Abigail Spamberger and Mikey Sherrill. And so I think it makes sense that, now we are 8 years later, I guess. A lot of these folks are now continuing to move up the political ladder and run for higher office. So I tend to think it probably has more to do with kind of their own political talent and their own political ambitions rather than any larger trend about the types of lawmakers who are in the House. But I do think there is on both sides definitely frustration among moderates in the House, which have become an increasingly rare species. You have folks like Jared Golden on the Democratic side and Don Bacon on the Republican side who are both retiring, and they have both expressed frustration with their own party for going further to the extremes on some issues. So I do think that it is increasingly difficult to be a moderate member of the House. But we'll see what happens with some of these competitive primaries. I think there's certainly a lot of competitive Senate primaries on the Democratic side that are going to be really interesting to watch and could kind of determine, I think the Senate obviously has tended to have a little bit more centrist lawmakers, and these are folks who are older and are obviously serving longer terms. And the House has been home to some of the more extreme members. But we'll see who comes out of these primaries, and depending on what sort of environment we're in, you might not need a particularly moderate candidate to win a competitive race if a wave kind of sweeps them over the edge. And so that'll be interesting to watch, I think, particularly on the Senate side.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Welcome to our Q&A section, our favorite part. And we have a question from Caroline, and she asked, very timely, why do celebrities like Paris Hilton come to Capitol Hill? And if people don't know, she came last week and Lauren got to see her, which I'm so jealous. So Lauren, please tell everybody why celebrities come to the Hill and why they come more frequently than people think.
Yeah, honestly, I mean, I've seen, I guess, Paris Hilton now twice in my 3 years on the Hill. She is really big and well known for her advocacy on the Hill. Previously, it was for child protection laws, and now they're looking at getting compensation for victims that were victims of like AI pornography. So like deep fakes that people use, like Grok has been in very big heat, which is Elon Musk's AI platform on Twitter, because they allowed this new feature where you could put in images and Grok re-images it. And in a lot of those, there have been deep fake porn of minors or adults that obviously don't have consent. They're non-consensual. And so a bill passed earlier this year to prohibit that from happening, but it didn't provide any compensation for victims. So now they're pushing for compensation for victims to allow these victims to bring civil lawsuits against the people who made these pictures or videos or whatever they made of these people that obviously they didn't have consent from. So that's what she was up here for. But I mean, we've seen a slew of celebrities. I saw 50 Cent one time at 8:30 a.m. I was like, how am I seeing 50 Cent just past me at 8:30 a.m.
on me, and I was like,
yes,
what are you doing here? It was so, sometimes we know that they're coming. They will pair, the celebrity will pair with a member. So like for Paris Hilton, she was paired with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Laurel Lee. And so that was something that their offices were kind of pushing out, like, hey, we're doing a press conference. Other times, like, unless you're maybe on that one specific member's distribution list, you're not going to know the celebrities there until they're in the hallways. And you're like, oh. And we see, like, I know, and some people, I guess for us, we've talked about this before, that we don't see celebrities anymore the way that other people see celebrities. Like, for some people, if like Pete Buttigieg walked down the hall or was in their hometown, they'd be like, oh my God, it's a celebrity. But for us, we're like, oh, that's just like somebody we interview for work. And we did last year. So like, it's just, it's interesting that a lot of celebrities do come up, and whether they're politicians. Last week, a little bit, maybe not as like flashy as Paris Hilton, but Maryland Governor Wes Moore was on the Hill. And that was really
celebrity
cool.
To us.
Yeah, like just, it was kind of cool. And I went to the press conference and I got to stand literally super close to him. I had the best video in my opinion. And like, it was just cool to see him in person, because this is somebody who like could be a presidential hopeful. So this could really become a celebrity, you know? So like, it is kind of fun that on the Hill we get to see all these people.
I know. I think it's fun. I always love seeing like pop culture celebrities because I'm such a pop culture
Yeah,
fan.
you have to
I
explain to
never,
me who these people are all the
yes,
time.
I never would have been a TMZ reporter because that's just too much for me, but I do keep up with like all things pop culture. And so whenever obviously Pete Buttigieg or Wes Moore are really cool to see, but we see major politicians every single day. People, I think I've gotten so many questions about I made a video with AOC last week and people are like, "Oh my God, how'd you see her?" I'm like, "We see her every day. Like we talk
You're
to
like, I
her
talk
every
to her at
day."
least once a week.
Um, but these celebrities that are more Hollywood based celebrities that I love and follow, I still get a little bit starstruck whenever I see them. The first time I interacted with Paris Hilton, I ran into her physically, like pretty much physically. I ran into her team
Oh,
and I gasped so loud that her entire team of like 50 turned to look at me. So I still do kind of fangirl over the
that's so
Hollywood
funny.
celebrities.
That's so funny. Yeah, I think we both met Gene Simmons, and that was a crazy experience. Just like, and
That's
someone
the way
like
to put it.
our parents were just like, oh my God, I can't believe like, so like, it's just fun to tell people from different walks of
Mm-hmm.
life, different celebrities that we're meeting, because you wouldn't think that being a political journalist on Capitol Hill would get you in connection with like Hollywood's biggest stars.
Totally.
But they do, because celebrities also have advocacy and things that they want to do as well. And so definitely sometimes
Yeah.
it's a little bit, oh wow, can't believe this job is real.
I mean, they have major platforms. Like, obviously, they are easier to get into advocacy than an average person. They have money, they have resources, they have power. And so, like, them using that for good, I think is good. I think that a lot of celebrities obviously stray away from politics, and also do totally understand that take.
Mhm.
But now I'm going to advocate for Taylor Swift to come to the Hill. I know that she is
Ooh.
obviously she endorses in presidential races, but other than that, doesn't like get I guess too involved like publicly. I'm sure she does in the
Mhm.
weeds that I am not necessarily sure of, but that's what I'm hoping for and going to manifest this year or
Well, I'm
next
going to
year.
manifest that Taylor Swift watches our show. And so maybe one day she
Yes.
will, and she'll hear this and she'll think, oh, I need to come on that show. So, Taylor Swift, this is your official invitation to come and join us.
Yes. Well, with that, that's a wrap. Thanks for watching Capital Conversations with Rachel and Lauren.
And as always, make sure to like and subscribe, follow us on all of our platforms. Y'all know the drill. And as always, read at WashingtonExaminer.com.